Welcome. This is a video workshop, one of two this week, where we try to get into the mystery and demystifying of writing and writing instruction. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we have an understanding of where writing instruction and the ideas of how we teach writing even come from. So first we will talk a little bit about the history and complexities of composition and composition theory. Before we begin, let's think about the term or concept or act of writing. So I'd like you to take your daybook and to think about the following questions. See if you can even do this. Think about what is writing. In a few sentences, try to define writing. Come back to this video, just take a minute or two and see how you do. Was that kind of hard? Probably was. Why do you think that it's hard to define writing? You all are perfectly literate students, teachers, citizens, yet when we try to put our thoughts down about what writing is, it's difficult. We want to know why, and history may help us with that. So a little bit about where I'm coming from and how I'm going to talk over the next few minutes for this video workshop is important. So my research and my dissertation was in teacher identity and how teachers' identities may affect how we conceptualize things like writing and the teaching of writing and how we enact those concepts. So my review of history is grounded in what's called discourse. So Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, historian, literary critic, he talks about discourse as the signs embodying a certain system, like speech or writing. And then fast forward a few years, and James Paul Gee, who is a pretty well-known linguist and now really into literacy education and research surrounding that, further delineates a big D and a little d version of discourse. And the big D is the system at hand, usually the setting. So for instance, this class could be considered a big D discourse. And if we were in a face-to-face classroom, the classroom itself, the physical space, would be the big D discourse, so the system. And then the little d discourse would be the moves being made to make that system work or be successful in that system. A good visual that I always like to use is if we were in a face-to-face classroom together, the big D discourse expectations, our understanding of that system, would probably mean that your little d discursive move of where you sat, for instance, would be in a place where you could probably see what you think is the front of the room. You, for instance, wouldn't sit and turn your back to where the teacher was or where the board was. So big D discourse, your understanding of that space of the classroom, would dictate what your little d discourse move would be. And so this is important because we are constantly constructing who we are and what we are doing through language based on this given big D discourse. So this helps us analyze the big D discourse of writing and writing instruction and might dictate some of the little d moves that we're going to talk about throughout this video workshop. So one thing we need to realize about writing instruction is that it's really a lot to do with a battle for control, a lot to do with power. So one thing that comes about when trying to understand writing instruction and what writing is the question of who gets to decide what is worth knowing in composition. Is it scholars, so important people over the years who have made and named ways of writing or how we should think about writing? Is it researchers, like one of my favorite people here, Lil Brannon, one of the authors of the Thinking Out Loud Daybook book? Is it researchers and teachers and educators? Is it classroom teachers, the people who they say are, quote, down in the trenches, the people who are working with the pre-K through 12 students? Who gets to decide? So part of the reason why we still have questions about writing and its teaching is because we don't often know who we're supposed to look to and who we're supposed to trust. So Stephen North, who has done a lot of research, particularly in writing centers, explained in his influential book, The Making of Knowledge in Composition, Portrait of an Emerging Field, that there's a battle for control between these entities, scholars, researchers, and classroom teachers. Who gets to decide what's worth knowing? And there's issues of power, prestige, professional recognition, and advancement are at stake. So it's an important and hefty topic. So now, as I move forward, I'm going to use James Berlin's categories of composition theory to help us understand the history and why there's such mystery, contention, and continuous dialogue about writing and its teaching. If you remember, Berlin is referenced and is the basis for the categories in the opening chapter of a guidebook, A Guide to Composition Pedagogies, that we read last week. So you'll hopefully hear some familiar terms as we move forward. So let's get started. So we talked a little bit in English 501 about how it's difficult to define English studies because it's kind of this blend of all what used to be these separate areas of study, like rhetoric. And so English is kind of the child of a broken home. One important historical moment was in 1914, shortly after the 1892 Committee of 10 meeting of the National Education Association decided they wanted to link or saw links between literature and composition at the high school level. College composition became connected with high school, so we saw some, hey, what we're doing in a high school level might need to recognize what's going on in college and vice versa. And that move kind of officially began the separation of any lasting remnants of classical rhetoric, such as speech and linguistics, as part of the teaching of English. So once that happens, when you think of an English class from here on out, this point in history and forward, you don't think of rhetoric. You think of literature and writing, composition. Doesn't mean that those elements aren't incorporated, but typically rhetoric becomes a separate class that someone might take at the high school or college level. So out of that, when we realized that we needed to start more specifically teaching composition, because up until this point, we didn't. We just thought people knew how to write, and that was that. And there was a recognition that some attention needed to be made. The development of what we now call current traditional rhetoric was created. And I want you to think as I'm talking about how these ideas are still evident today. So current traditional, to kind of use this image, embodies the idea of product over process. This comes during a time where scientific investigation and positivist notions of how we make knowledge, it's out there, we've just got to go find it, trickled over into writing instruction. It's what was important in our society and educational realm, period. There's an arms for being the best country, being the first at everything, and that was rooted in ideas of science, which was very much, you have a hypothesis, you prove your or disprove your hypothesis, and so with writing, it kind of equated to the idea that a writer knows exactly what they want to write. Please give them the boxes and the places to put it, and they will have the right words to include. So this is a post-World War II, the idea that if students learn these basic patterns of writing, they could apply them in new combinations in any genre and any context. So if you just figure out these patterns, then no matter what you're doing or what you're writing, you can slot your ideas very neatly into those new patterns. And that is considered current traditional rhetoric. So I want you to take a moment right now and think about what assumptions are made in this image of the student here. Pause, write in your daybook about that. And think about, too, what assumptions about writing in current traditional rhetoric or theory of composition are made based on your history and what you have come to know and believe is what writing is. So I'm excited to hear about what you thought and what assumptions were being made. That might be something that you share in a future weekly musing in the coming weeks. So you may be sitting here thinking that ideas of current traditional are archaic. You would never want to learn writing that way. You would never teach writing that way. But yet it still persists. Notions, and we'll talk more in depth in future weeks about this, but ideas of 5-paragraph essay writing can often embody current traditional, the idea that we sit down, we know what we want to write, and we just plug it into kind of a common formula. And this persists because it's quantifiable. In many ways, when you assess something that's a product, you're looking for very specific things and you can kind of check them off. They're either there or not there, which is very seducing for a teacher of writing. We'll talk in the future also about the paper load, and it's really nice when you're able to check boxes to help provide a student with an assessment. It's efficient. It kind of embodies the idea of preparing for the workforce, work fast, work efficient. And then with literature studies, that's a written product. That's a finished product. So why wouldn't we want to try to teach our students how to create something like that? So a final polish piece. So again, current traditional, focusing on the final product. Well, historically, some things changed. And around the mid-60s, we start to develop this notion of cognitive rhetoric. And this came out of Anglo-American seminar on the teaching of English at Dartmouth College, which addressed several issues surrounding the discipline of English. And so from this, we have, quote, a definition of English as a classroom subject. Officially, we started to hear it, as I said, in the early 1900s, but it really started to become defined and really considered a subject, not until this kind of the 60s truly, which is kind of crazy. But the place of literature in the curriculum, it helped define this, and the training of English teachers. We started to realize historically and in research that, hey, people who are teaching this stuff might need to be trained in it. So we have that Dartmouth, that conference going on. And then also in 1974, the National Council of Teachers of English is created, and the Commission on Composition issued a position statement emphasizing that writing was a humane and liberating activity, one that could help students to expand and enlarge their worlds to live more fully. So cognitive rhetoric comes out of this. So the idea that writing is situated in rhetorical language practice. And it began to materialize, shifting the focus from the product of writing to how writers write. So lots of studies came about looking at how does someone start with an idea and then create that final product. And so this is where we get the stages of writing, the writing process, ideas of pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, publishing, etc. The lasting remnants of this we'll see even in this class. You'll hear me take you through a process, ask you to start with generative ideas and use them in the daybook, and then move you to something that would look like a final product. The one element of cognitive rhetoric that varies, say, from a more social or collaborative rhetoric is that it's a linear phase, a linear process of writing. So, of course, you start with pre-writing, and then you move to drafting, and then you move to revising, then editing, then polishing. And there's not really room for going back. It's a constant move forward. And again, the emphasis is still on the final product. Okay, so we're going to pause our history for right now, and I want you to take a moment to ask yourself, what are you thinking now? What connections are you making to these ideas of theory and your own histories as writers, experiences in school, etc.? And then what do you want to know more about? So take some daybook time and reflect on that. And we're going to come back in future weeks to continue this history. We need to take it in small chunks because it's a lot to process and kind of comprehend. So where I expect to see some of this reflection manifest itself for this particular video workshop is in your future weekly musings. So there's no specific blog post for this video workshop, which is separate from the Module 2 workshop for this week. I look forward to hearing what you come up with.